Well, this is take two. I just watched my first attempt at doing this, and the PowerPoint stayed at the same slide the entire time. Pretty much worthless. So we're trying it again, and we hope that this technology works. All right. So we're talking World War II. Repping the U.S. Marine Corps hoodie. Been immersed in all things World War II. Today we're going to go off script. You're going to want a separate sheet of paper probably. Sorry, but not sorry. Because this stuff should have been on the note sheet, and I blame my secretary for not putting it on. Oh well. So we're going to make the best of that situation. So we're going to talk about today. We're talking about the French resistance. We're going to talk about sub-warfare. We're going to talk about the Nazi enigma. We're going to talk about Nazi Wolfpacks. So hopefully you'll find that engaging and interesting. So let's check out the PowerPoint and hope it works. Okay. So this is the slide actually that my first attempt was stuck at. Oh well. All right. So this, I put this in, we were talking about D-Day. And so this is a great map, shows you the 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. You see Point du Hoc right here. We talked about that last time. You can see the map kind of gives you a code. So for example, number 1 uncircled is the US 82nd Airborne, and then number 2 is the US 101st Airborne. So some of you are reading Band of Brothers, that would be the 101st, and how they drop behind enemy lines. And then you see that the different American and British and Canadian units, and then likewise with the German information over here. So that's just another good map. This says Allied Naval Force, 5,000 battleships. They weren't really battleships, right? That's whoever made this map shouldn't have used that term. It's not specific. It's all the ships involved in the invasion. All right, before I move on to the French resistance, some of you are asking about the Saint Anna part in the notes. So just to review quickly, that's right before Operation Overlord. In the village of St. Anna in Italy, German troops rounded up the villagers and killed them all because they suspected that they had killed a couple of Germans or something like this. And this was not a unique situation. The Germans were very vicious, especially if they thought civilians or partisans had killed any of their own. So you remember I showed a video earlier in class about how in Serbia, Germans rounded up a bunch of men and hung some of them and executed the other by gunfire. This also happened in 1944 in a British town of Bordeaux, where the SS massacred 642 people. They basically annihilated the whole village because it was suspected that the French civilians had killed, or French resistance had killed, one SS officer. So just horrific things the Germans did in their brutal Nazi regime over even their allies like the Italians or conquered enemies like the French. So the French resistance also played a part kind of leading up to D-Day. They spied on the Germans. They interrupted rail traffic. They cut telegraph lines. This man here, Jean Moulin, was a head of the French resistance. He actually met with Charles de Gaulle and was in England for a time, then parachuted back into France, but eventually was captured by the Nazis and tortured for an extended period of time before he died of the torture. So just horrific. So he was a hero. the French resistance also went by the name of the Maquis or Maquis. So here's some members down here. And then Virginia Hall was an American, I believe, who was a spy to help the French resistance gather information helpful to the Allies. All right, we're switching gears here to naval warfare, specifically sub warfare. This has a little bit to do with our next topic, the Battle of the Marianas, because our subs were operating around the Marianas and also the Philippines in this time. We had a huge problem, though. Maybe the biggest failure of the U.S. Navy was this torpedo here, the Mark 14. Supposed to be one of a great advancement created during the interwar period, but it had a huge flaw, and that was its detonating mechanism in the warhead. So what was supposed to happen is a sub would release one of these torpedoes, and then it had a magnetic detonator in it. So when it got underneath actually an enemy ship, the magnetic detonator was supposed to sense the iron and the steel of the hull and explode the warhead, but it didn't work. Sometimes it was too sensitive and it would go off prematurely because just the magnetic field of the Earth is stronger in different places than others. And sometimes it wouldn't go off at all. It also had a way that you could change the warhead, so it was supposed to explode on contact, but this mechanism was also faulty. In one example, a U.S. submarine captain fired 15 torpedoes at a slow and disabled Japanese tanker, and out of the 15, only 1 or 2 even exploded. And the rest of them just hit the tanker and just dented it without exploding. And it was because this detonating mechanism they discovered was faulty. So the man, originally, the U.S. department that was in charge of making the torpedoes was ignoring all these reports that the torpedoes were faulty. You see, they didn't really test this very much. These torpedoes were really expensive to make, cost about $10,000 a piece. And so the U.S. Navy was very hesitant to test them very much before the war because it was so expensive. And then the war, we jumped into the war after Pearl Harbor, and we had these untested torpedoes, which turned out to be a huge mistake for the U.S. Navy because they thought, hey, we're saving money by not testing these things. This is like during the Great Depression, right? But then they ended up shooting so many in the war that were duds that I'm sure they lost far more because they didn't have a reliable torpedo during the early part of the war. So in the first 100 torpedoes or so that we shot in the war, only 3 of them, or we only sunk 3 ships. 3 ships with almost 100 torpedoes. That's terrible. By mid-1942, we had fired 800 torpedoes at enemy ships, and 80% of those torpedoes failed. 80% failure rate. Well, that's well over 600 torpedoes at $10,000 a pop that were just wasted because they didn't work. And sometimes we lost submarines and crews because the enemy ships would be able to go attack our ships, our submarines, after our torpedoes failed and they knew where we were. So this was a problem. So this man over here, Charles Lockwood, was a real admiral stationed outside of Australia. And when reports came into him about how terrible these torpedoes were, he actually listened, and he went all the way to the upper echelons of the Navy to make them fix this. And he ruffled a lot of feathers to do that. He tested it himself, found it was faulty. They actually discovered that the detonator, which was supposed to work the best when it hit an enemy ship on a T at a 90 degrees, actually the torpedo went off more reliably on sharp angles, which is not what you want, because they taught their submarine captains to try the ship on the side, not to aim and try to hit the ship moving on an angle like this. So he did a ton of work. They redesigned the mechanism, produced a much more reliable detonator, and then from thence on, our submarines did a much better job at sinking enemy ships. And that was a huge success from the middle part of the war on. But initially, maybe our biggest failure in the war. Charles Lockwood also had some new ideas about how to even use our subs. So instead of going after destroyers and battleships and cruisers as targets of opportunity, he suggested that we use our submarines to attack merchant ships, oil tankers, weaker, slower vessels that were easier to hit, that were vital to the Japanese war effort, because the Japanese needed to import supplies, especially oil, etc., to build their war machine. And so if we could take out their oil, we ended up limiting about 80% of their oil intake by sinking tankers with our subs, etc. He also had our subs hunt in threes, so kind of similar to what the Germans were doing with their U-boats. And so in this way, he was a brilliant addition to our submarine warfare. A couple of notable U.S. subs. This is the USS Harder that went on many successful patrols, sinking a lot of enemy ships. Its captain here would win the U.S. Medal of Honor for his heroics as a submarine captain. He actually, after 5 patrols, grueling patrols, when he came back to port at Darwin, Australia, he was offered the chance to be done. But his crew was being changed over because just of the rotation of the U.S. Navy at the time, and he didn't want his crew to go out without an experienced commander. So he went out for a 6th patrol, and on that 6th patrol, he and his sub were lost. So, but he won the Medal of Honor for his heroics, and you can read the citation here. This is the USS Sea Wolf, another very successful U.S. sub, but this one did over a dozen patrols, I think, in the war, SS-197. This is not the only USS Sea Wolf we had in our history. However, this one was, we think, sunk by friendly fire, that a destroyer escort mistook it for a Japanese sub and sunk it. So it just shows you like how grueling and difficult submarine warfare was. In fact, approximately 20% of all of our submarine sailors died in the war, which was the highest mortality rate of any branch of service across any theater in the war. So 1 out of every 5. All right, now switching to the Germans. The German Kriegsmarine. So you see a statistic there. They sank 397 ships. This is mainly U-boats in a 6-month period, losing only 7 U-boats. So I asked the question there, what if Hitler invested in hundreds of U-boats instead of battleships like the Bismarck? See, Hitler wasn't really into U-boats. They didn't have very many at the beginning of the war. But after their surface fleet was basically annihilated, they had to switch to U-boats, just kind of like World War I. And they should have done this at the very beginning. Some historians speculate that if they had gone to strictly U-boats at the beginning of the war and used it as a primary hunting tactic, they could have extended the war for sure, maybe defeated the British. So another one of Hitler's mistakes. I'm actually going to show you a video here on the German Wolfpack, what that means and how it came about. And you're going to hear a couple of German sub commanders talk about the fighting. And then we're also going to look at, I think there's a British fella, captain, who talks about his survival after being attacked by a German sub. So I gotta back this up a second.
When war began, Britain saw Germany's big ships as the main threat to her sea trade. So did the Germans. Germany's surface raiders would savage the merchant fleet on which Britain depended for much of her food, most of her raw materials, and all of her oil. Germany's U-boats were to operate in coastal waters, sweeping up anything left by the battleships. Both Britain and Germany were wrong. The real naval menace was to be the U-boat. At least one man knew this, Karl Dönitz, chief of the U-boat arm. He could have been wrong too, if Hitler had delayed his war with Britain until all the battleships planned for the German Navy had been built. As it was, Dönitz was certain that with enough submarines, he could win the war at sea. He had proved it to himself 20 years before.
In October 1918, I was captain of a submarine in the Mediterranean near Malta. In a dark night, I met a British convoy with cruisers and destroyers. And I attacked and I sank a ship. But the chance would have been very much greater if there had been a lot of submarines. That's why the idea of a Wolfpack to put the submarines together that they could attack together was very impressive. And that's why in all the years from 1918 until the year 1935, where we had the first submarines again in the German Navy, I never had forgotten this idea.
Underwater, the 1939 U-boat was slow. On the surface, it was faster than any convoy of merchant ships. With its low silhouette, it could not be seen easily, especially at night. But its targets were outlined clearly against the sky. And with radio, the U-boats could quickly assemble into hunting packs. Dönitz knew Britain would try to protect her essential Atlantic trade by a system of convoys escorted by warships. To attack these convoys, Dönitz wanted 300 U-boats. When the war started, he had only 26. And these boats had long, dangerous voyages from base before they could reach their targets. When France fell, Dönitz gained new bases much nearer the shipping routes. His Sea Wolves returned to these French ports as heroes. One especial hero was Otto Kretschmer. In all, Kretschmer sank over 250,000 tons of British shipping. In October 1940, he joined the first real Wolfpack.
I remember that there was a signal that a convoy was coming in from America to England, and that its position was not known, and that Dönitz ordered all the submarines there to the west of Ireland to form a sort of recce line, stationary recce line, to let the convoy pass through. And when the first submarine was sighted, the convoy made a signal, its contact signal. This recce line was dissolved automatically, and every boat was free to go in for the attack.
Convoy SC7 on the night of the 17th of October 1940 was passing Rockall. 24 merchantmen, 4 small escort ships. 7 U-boats attacked on the surface.
The attack took the same form as that we were used to, which was a single ship being struck. Very shortly after that, a second one was struck. And then, within a matter of 5 to 10 minutes, further ships were struck.
I tried to get through the escorts into the convoy, which was my own peculiarity of attacking, and failed for the first time. They saw me and shot star shells so that I had to draw away again. But for the second time I succeeded and was inside the convoy, going up and down the lanes and looking for the most important, valuable ships, and had the opportunity to expand all torpedoes. I had 12 in all.
Legacy ships in various stages of sinking. The Dutch ship had stopped and was attempting to pick up survivors. And whilst I actually watched her doing this and was considering what to do about it, she also herself was torpedoed. This, along with another torpedo, set the whole place ablaze.
That night, 17 merchantmen, exactly half the convoy, were sunk. The escorts had not been able to damage a single U-boat.
I don't think I'd ever seen more than one ship sunk at a time before, and this was something very different indeed.
This really was the first time that this tactics could be experienced by all of us, and also by Dönitz himself, who of course knew it only from our peacetime training. And the whole night, I think, was a success. It was called the night of the long knives, because so many ships were sunk.
In the first 9 months of the war, Britain and her allies lost over 2 million tons of merchant shipping. In the next 6 months, with the U-boats operating from France, nearly 2.5 million tons more went down. There were medals galore. U-boat crews called this a happy time.
I saw the ship going up the stern, going underwater, and she upended right up on end and went backwards. I went down with her. After a bit, I came to the surface, and I was still sitting onto the overturned bridge boat, and I saw the submarine servicing. He went down and started picking up cases out of the water. General cargo, possibly spirits, food stuff, and so forth. They looked at us and circled around for a bit. They laughed at us and went away to the northeast. They never asked if we had any water, we had any damages, or anything else. And we were left, floating amongst wreckage with one boat. We're halfway between Brazil and North Africa. One thing I could think about was trying to get to the land as near as possible, so I set the course as near as I could to the northeast. All we had was the one lifeboat, which was made for 48 people. We picked up 58. There wasn't really room enough for anybody to sit down. The boat was leaking badly through being on the chocks for some time. You had quite a bit of trouble getting the crew to move so you could bail. When you bailed for nearly 2 days, until the wood of the boat started to swell and to tighten up. After that, it wasn't so bad. The worst days, of course, when there was no wind, absolutely becalmed. The sun was terrific. So we started off by giving 4 ounces of water, 2 ounces in the morning and 2 ounces at night, and 1 biscuit. And there was a lot of noise in the boat. There were Chinese. And I said, what's all the bobbery? Which is a lot of talky, you know. He said, I think number 1 fireman go crazy. Huh? So he eventually jumped over the side with a life jacket on. And after a wee while, we got him back again. And later that night in the dance, he jumped again. We didn't get him back because the sharks got him. On the morning of the 13th, I used to sit on the water barrel to make sure nobody could help themselves. And somebody shook me up and said, hey, Captain, We see lights, green lights. Oh, I said, you're dreaming, you're dreaming. And I looked round and I saw some green lights. It looked at me like they were bright and clear. I couldn't make it out. So I said, well, burn a flare. They burned a flare. Jimmy said, buy another, burned another flare. They burned another flare. And after a bit, I saw the green lights getting closer, more visible. Then after a bit, I saw a red light above the green. And then it dawned on me that it was a hospital ship.
The U-boats had eyes in the air. Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft could range 1,000 miles out to sea to scout for convoys. When used to bomb shipping, the Condors sank 30 ships in 2 months. Luckily for Britain, this partnership with the U-boat was never properly exploited. But Dönitz did exploit the fact that German naval intelligence had broken the British codes.
We were aware that the intelligence for some reason was good, but I myself put this down to very superior hydrophone equipment that the submarines had, that the U-boats had in their boats, probably being able to pick up the noise of a convoy's propellers up to 80 or even 100 miles. But in addition, I know that they would place their U-boats in a line across at right angles to the expected line of the convoy. And this line for, say, 5 U-boats could be 100 miles from end to end. And so with good hydrophones, very little disguise of the position of a convoy could be effected. It was only after the war that we knew that they were breaking the codes and that they knew very well the time of leaving port that the convoys had and how many escorts were and how many merchant ships in each convoy.
All right, so hopefully you found that informative. Things to realize there, that one German sub commander, he actually got inside of the convoy past the escorts and was going up and down the rows of the ships, sinking them as targets, the best targets of opportunity. And just how the other German commander said that it was actually in World War I, at the close of the war, that he thought to himself, man, we find these convoys, it's hard for one sub to attack them, but if we had a lot of subs, a lot of U-boats, we could do a lot of damage. And so in the example they showed, they took out 17 ships out of a 34 ship convoy, and this revolutionized U-boat warfare. The one downside was when they radioed each other, the U-boat commanders radioed each other, then the British could pick that up, and that would warn them to the presence of the U-boats. But so it's this, British listening to the U-boats. The U-boats had learned, the Germans had learned how the British codes worked, and so I'm actually going to stop the video here, and then I'll start another video talking about how the British eventually would, and the Americans would, win the battle against the German U-boats.